Do I need to go here or just talk right here? Is that good? All right. Is this one? Hello? Should I get closer? Should I just talk like this the whole time? It's bad for my back. But okay. All right. Thank you everybody for coming. It's a really nice to see everybody. It's a good mix of ages. Today we're going to talk about the history of cybersecurity, the history of malware. My name is Eliad. We'll have like a whole who am I slide at the end, but there's so much to cover. Also kind of ironic, I wrote this talk about 2 years ago. So the good news is not much has changed about the malware in the 80s. The bad news is I hope I can deliver it the same way I did 2 years ago. But today what I want to do is I want to take us all to, in a journey through time and space, and we're going to talk about how malware evolved. I really like the topic. It's a really interesting topic, but it's important. If you're a student of cybersecurity, it's great for you to know these things. What were the inspirations? What were the motivations? How did these things come up? How early they came up? And let's see if we can learn something along the line. If you're a veteran, you're probably going to have fun reminiscing. And maybe all of us can just look at this history and get into the spirit of the time, because malware meant different things throughout the history. So in the 80s, malware was different than what it was in the 90s, the 2000s, and today. Let's start with a question. This looks like a classroom. Who knows when was the first ransomware incident? Does anybody know? It's kind of a well-known story. No? Okay. 89, that's right. 1989. Does anybody know the name? No, that's 99, I think. Or maybe a little later than that. No, sorry, 90, 95, 94. It's earlier than 99, yeah. The AIDS Trojan, very well done. All right, so the first ransomware was in 1989. It was called the AIDS Trojan. It's a very bad, very poor name, but we'll talk about why that was the name. I think it's, for starters, this is a really funny, interesting fact. In 1989, a lot of the people in this room weren't born in 1989. How is that possible that ransomware, something that we know from the past, let's say a decade, it became really a big phenomenon in the last decade, has existed or was first created in 1989? How is this even possible? It took a lot of creativity and a lot of ingenuity to actually create a ransomware in 1989. There was a guy called Joseph L. Pope, and Joseph L. Pope had this brilliant idea. He thought, okay, if I can create a software that hijacks people's computers, blackmails them for money, for the control of their computers, I can make millions. And he was so convinced of his idea, and he wrote the software, and he bought a bunch of floppy disks. This is 1989. There is no internet. There's ARPANET, but this is not something that everyone's connected to. He bought floppy disks, 20,000 of them. 20,000 floppy disks in 1989 was a huge investment of money. That's how convinced he was. He knew that you need to spend money to make money. But he took these floppy disks, he sent them by mail to a bunch of people. And we can talk about where he got those lists. And the deal was, if you put that floppy disk in your computer, sometime afterwards, your computer would ask you to turn on the printer, and then it would print out a ransom note. Because, kids today, they get their ransom notes directly on their background. But back then, you needed to check if you had toner in your printer to get ransomed. And then, you had to send money to a P.O. box in Panama, because Joseph L. Pope was such a genius that he thought he would just take a vacation immediately after. This had impact. This was a very, very creative malware, and it actually had impact similar to what we see with malware today. It was creative. It was interesting because what it did was it would fake a DOS environment. DOS was sort of the operating system of the time. And it would fake this environment. It was like you were locked in to an environment that he had created for you. You couldn't escape it. It was very difficult to escape it. And in the background, your files would get encrypted and their names would change. So for anyone that didn't really understand computers back then, and there weren't that many people who did, this was a very confusing experience. Now, when I talked about the name, the AIDS Trojan or the AIDS information software, Joseph L. Pope was a scientist, and he was somehow connected to AIDS research. He was in those circles. So he was able to get lists, address lists, because back then you had to fish people by snail mail, right? So he got those address lists, and he sent this to people who, some of them were working in AIDS research. And some of the impact that this had caused was that people who were reportedly, there was a lab in Italy that had lost 10 years of research, of AIDS research, very important research. And this was because it was very hard to, a lot of people just didn't understand what was going on. And this is very typical for early viruses. People did not understand what was going on with their computer. So this impact actually was what got Joseph L. Pope taken into custody, and not because the authorities were looking for him under every rock and in every crevice, but well, I don't know if they made a lot of effort to catch him, but actually he was guilt-ridden by knowing that what he did had caused, well, you might say this was foreseeable, but he was guilt-ridden, and he turned himself in at an airport in Amsterdam, and then they took him in Amsterdam, they tried him. And he came to the courthouse with like curlers in his beard, and he was wearing like cardboard hats. And it really seemed like the man had gone crazy. So they let him go, because in 1989, if you write ransomware, you might be crazy. You probably are. And that was the story of dear old Joseph L. Pope. It's a really, really interesting story. It's also a story about a Trojan. This was a Trojan. It was malware. It was pretending to be something else. The AIDS information software was this sort of calculator that helped you calculate. It was completely useless. It's pointless. It's just to help you calculate the chances of having AIDS. I don't remember exactly, but it wasn't. But it pretended to be something else. Trojans are going to make a great comeback later on. We're going to put a pin in them, and we're going to move on. So, to really understand early malware, early viruses in the 80s, you really need to understand what computers meant to people. And we can do this by kind of looking at pop culture, literature. In pop culture, computers were these things that enabled magic, wondrous things to happen. In Star Wars, Star Trek, these were things that enabled space flights, teleportation. War Games is a great movie if anybody wants to watch some hacker classic film. In War Games, the computer is one of the main characters. And so it was an environment in the 70s and 80s. We were still trying to understand the potential of computers as they sort of interact with humanity. And in this environment of wonder, people were asking themselves questions like, what is possible? And this is an interesting sort of a number of columns that I kind of picked up on, I think really tell this story in a very interesting way. In 1984, there was a man called Alexander Dudney, and he wrote a column for the Scientific American. And Alexander Dudney wrote this game called Core Wars. It's a really cool game. In his words, it's two computer programs in their native habitat, stalk each other, they fight. It's like battle bots, but with like coding. No chainsaws, just clickety-clack. And this was a really, really interesting game. They would work like, they'd have instructions, kind of like assembly instructions, and then you would tell it what to do, it would go over the instructions, and hopefully you put two programs in the same space, and one of them would emerge victorious. But he said, I got this idea because I'd heard of this fantastical story, this myth about this virus that got out of control in some lab, and it took over the lab. And then they had to write another virus to hunt down the first virus, and that second virus would then delete itself. And that's the only way, like this sort of sci-fi story. And he said, yeah, it's kind of a silly story. It's full of holes. But what if it was true? What if it could be true? And he says this inspired me to create this game. What if there really were these viruses kind of going between computers and infecting people and doing all sorts of things? Now, here's something to understand. In 1984, not a lot of people knew about computer viruses. There's a lot of possibilities. What I've read is one reason was that people didn't want to harm the sales of computers, so they just didn't really talk about it. Maybe it wasn't spreading fast enough. But when Alexander Dudney wrote this column, he asked people to send him letters with their creations, these battle bots that he wanted them to create for him, for his game. What he got instead was letters from all over the world, or I guess all over America, of people who actually had encountered viruses, worms, all sorts of things. And this was not something that Alexander Dudney expected. A year later, he writes another column in the Scientific American. It's called Core War Bestiary of Worms and Viruses and All Sorts of Creatures, something along those lines. In that column, he talks about the shock of receiving all of this information about actual viruses, and then he starts to detail those stories, sharing them with people. It was a big discovery for him, and he was thinking it would be a big discovery for other people. In 1989, Dudney writes another column for the Scientific American. That column he opens with a quote from Eugene Spefford. It goes something along the lines of, "The only safe computer system is one that's switched off, cast in a cement box, put in a room with guards, and even then I have my doubts." So that was 1989. So somewhere between 84 and 89, malware, viruses, went from sort of being vaguely understood, vaguely known, to being an absolute certainty. And we need to sort of ask ourselves what happened around that time. And we're going to talk about that now. And by the way, the story, this fantastical story that's full of holes, it's actually true. And I recommend people research this. This is attributed to be the first worm ever written, might be. It was called the Creeper. I don't know if I should get into a lot of details about it because I'm already too slow. But I would encourage people to check this out on their own. The Creeper and the Reaper is a very interesting story. It did happen in a lab at BBN Labs in Cambridge. It didn't go out of control, but it was a self-replicating virus, and it was the first one of its kind. It was a very, very interesting story about ingenuity and, how do you solve problems. They were trying to create programs that back themselves up. So that was a real story, that myth. That takes us all the way back to 71. I'm not going to do much more background, but I do want to just set the scene. Computers and personal computers are coming onto the scene around that time. 1977, you have your first trifecta of personal computers. The Apple II, TRS-80, Commodore, PET, and 1981, you have IBM PC. So people are starting to get computers in their homes, in their offices. People are starting to use these computers. This is a huge evolution for people because now you have access. And with great access, at least in the computer world, with great access comes zero responsibility and lots of power. So people started using these things and trying to test what they can do, the sense of wonder. Another thing is the sneaker net. So back then, there was no internet. There was maybe the ARPANET. Again, this was a sort of a system. Not a lot of computers were on it. But there wasn't the commercial internet that we know today. So how do you get things from computer A to computer B? Well, you carry them on your feet, which are wearing sneakers, I guess. And the sneaker net is the way that you transfer these things. This is good and bad for people who write malware. It's good because now you have this physical medium. You can put your program on and you can have it go to another computer. It's bad because the sneaker net those sneakers are connected to a thinking human being, who probably doesn't want to spread viruses. So you have to be clever. You have to be more clever than the people you're infecting. You have to be stealthy. You have to find ways, maybe delay the execution of the malicious part of your software. And this really creates, builds the sort of the atmosphere of very early viruses. Let's look at some of these early viruses. So here are some examples. You can see Cascade. These were sort of these experiments. They were whimsical. They were fun. These are, I'm talking about the first half of the 80s, let's say 81 to 85. They weren't really meant to cause a lot of harm. They would write things like peace on earth, Dukakis for president. I don't know, does anybody remember Dukakis as yeah, okay, good. You know, they would do really funny things, and they would cause all these really weird interruptions. And in 1985, if you had all the letters dropping on your computer, you had no idea what to do, and you weren't sure what's going on. But these were, I don't know, maybe you can categorize them as something similar to graffiti, right? Graffiti is not meant to break the wall that it's painted on. It's meant to make a statement, or maybe make something look pretty. So these were the types of viruses that you would see in the early part of the 80s. And the people who wrote them, I mean, I'm sure there were various motivations for this, but I want to focus on one specific one. Elk Cloner, 1982. This is an Apple II virus, if not the first, then one of the first. Elk Cloner was written by this person called Richard Skrenta, and he was a young man. He got his first personal computer in the 7th grade, when he was in the 7th grade, and he was in love with computers, like a lot of us, like many of us here in this room. By the 9th grade, he was writing, he was creating bootleg copies of games for his friends. But he was just like any other kid. He wanted to play some pranks, and he would create a kill switch in the game. So let's say the sixth time you would run the game would delete itself. So then his friends would play the games that he would bring them, the bootleg games, and then they would play it for 6 or 7 times, and then they would delete themselves exactly when they were like getting into it. And Richard was loving it, and his friends were hating it, and then nobody wanted to take any more games from Richard. Makes sense. So Richard had to find a way around that. And Richard wrote a virus. He wrote a boot sector virus. He started thinking, how can I make this, I think in his words, it was a sticky program. How can I make it sticky? He wrote a boot sector virus. A lot of viruses back then were boot sector viruses. The boot sector would run first, was the thing that boots first when you boot your computer. So you put this, if you have a floppy disk that's infected, it would run the virus first, and then it would presumably copy itself to the operating system, or copy itself to the machine, and then would infect other floppy disks as it would be used with the same computer. So Richard was able to create this virus, this Elk Cloner. And again, motivations, inspirations. Richard wasn't trying to harm anybody. He was just trying to have some fun. A lot of these viruses, the way that they worked is they would append themselves to programs. This is not exactly a boot sector virus, but a lot of them, you would have your boot sector virus, you would have viruses that would append themselves to programs. And when you run the program, you actually run the virus. Because these viruses would maybe append themselves to the end of the program, but they would jump from the beginning of the program, they would jump to the malware code, to the virus code, and then we would jump back to the beginning of the program. Sorry, just trying to make sure I'm on track, and I am not. And also they used what was called interrupts. So in these old operating system, interrupts were the ways that you would, it's kind of like system calls in Windows. All of these things kind of reminiscent of what we see in malware today. In some ways, putting your malware code, appending it to a program is not that different from emptying a program and putting your shell code in and having it run. Calling on interrupts is not that different from using system calls and so on. But Those were the days, and those were the ways that people used it. But we know that from the sort of or I told you, and you have to believe me because I'm on the podium here, and from the mid 80s or so, we start to see things change, and we start to see malware becoming more and more destructive. And it's really, really hard to pinpoint why and how and when it happened. But you start to see from that point on, where you start to see these big stories in the news about malware, like, oh my God, this infection. You start to see stories about computer viruses. One thing I love about malware in the 80s is just how sort of imaginative these names are. Viruses, it's sort of a metaphor. It evokes a lot of things. It's not an information stealer. Today we deal with a lot of information stealer. An information stealer, just it does what it does. But a worm, that's cool. That's interesting. Also, by the way, taken from a worm. A computer worm is taken from a book. Can't remember the name, if anybody can recall. But they were very interesting. They were very exciting for people. They still evoked that sense of wonder. Viruses. One of the first things that, one of the first viruses that had caused this sensation was the brain virus. That was in 1986. And the brain virus had two interesting things going for it. The first one is that it had infected a news organization, the Providence Journal. I don't remember how many computers, but a large number of computers in the Providence Journal was a newspaper were infected with this brain virus. The second thing that was interesting about the brain virus is it was written in Pakistan. And nobody knew how a virus from Pakistan made its way to Providence. Nobody knew how this could happen. And not just Providence, but a lot of other computers all over the United States. We know it's from Pakistan because the people who wrote the virus put their address in the code. This is another interesting story to check out. So look for the brain virus, and it's another very interesting one. So you have this huge story, the brain virus comes up in the news. People don't really know what to make of it. But over time, you start to see more and more stories in the news about these viruses. You also see books like this German book over there, Das große Computervirenbuch. It's a book about writing viruses, teaching people how to write viruses. This is written, I think, 1987 or so. So you start to have this information coming out. You start to see this sense of wonder. And we go from whimsical experimentation to really malicious, nasty stuff. For example, like Maltese Casino or Q Casino in 91. This was a virus that basically had you gamble with your computer. It would, it would steal your file allocation table. Without that, it's very difficult for you to know where your files were. And then it made you play a game. And you basically played a slot machine. And if you won, it would restore your file allocation table and everything is good. If you didn't win, you'd lose everything. Terrible. It was the Maltese Casino. And you have all these like names for these viruses. The Italian virus, which was researched in Bulgaria, and the Jerusalem virus. All of these things sort of created this sense of wonder. For example, the Jerusalem virus, 1987. The Jerusalem virus, I think the virus was supposed to delete all your files. And it did that at a specific point in time. So it was supposed to operate every Friday the 13th after 1988 and onwards, right? And why? Because maybe if you wrote it in 1987, you want to give it like a year's head start to spread, and then, bam, one day everything goes out. And the problem is people would discover these viruses before the activation point. And then there would be just this huge panic. Oh my God, what are we going to do? Everybody's computers are going to be deleted on Friday the 13th, 1988. and every single time it would be, it's kind of like a Y2K scare every few years. And those were the more destructive viruses. One of them that I really like talking about is the 1/2 virus. By the way, you mentioned Michelangelo. I think Michelangelo was the same thing. It had this point in time. It was supposed to execute. It's a huge. Yeah, okay. There you go. March 6th. and then just like panic. You know, imagine the news stories. Actually, you could go and find these news stories, and you see these newscasters that were just had completely out of their depth, you know, like big shoulder pads, just talking about computer doctors and computer viruses and computer vaccines, and they just like had no idea how to. And then on the other side, you have these like computer people who were doing their best to explain it. But you can still find those on YouTube, and they're very, very fun to watch. This virus I wanted to talk to you about, the 1/2 virus, is a really, really interesting one. 1/2, first of all, technically was very interesting, but the concept of it was super cool. But it was pretty destructive. It would slowly encrypt your hard drive. So it would do like one sector every time you reboot, where every time you would start a program, one sector would get encrypted. But if you start having like encrypted sectors of your drive, you would immediately, very shortly after you try to start something that's partly encrypted, you would get an error. So what it would do is it would catch that, it would unencrypt the sector, whatever you're trying to access, and then it would give you would get the file. You wouldn't know that there was a virus that's slowly encrypting your computer until finally you would get a message that says, this is 1/2. And when that happens, presumably 1/2 of your hard drive is encrypted. Why is that a problem? Because the only thing that's unencrypting these files is the virus that's sitting on your machine. And so you now have a choice. If you remove the virus, you're left with an half encrypted drive. If you don't remove the virus, you're having some sort of symbiotic relationship with a virus. It was also pretty clever. Like, there's a lot of interesting things. For example, I told you viruses would append themselves to programs. This one did it a little bit different. This was 1994. It would look for empty sectors in a program, and then it would just like split itself up and put like instructions, and then just kind of jump from one instruction to the next, thereby creating some sort of polymorphism, metamorphism. It's sort of change it. It would also look for antivirus programs. Back in the 90s, I think in the early 90s, that's when you start to see antivirus programs. It would look for antivirus programs and it would avoid them. Just like modern malware today looks for antivirus programs. Also, the whole like way that it would decrypt itself was very clever. Those were the viruses. Now we're back touching a little bit on these Trojans and worms. As I said, the first Trojan was 1989. We have the first worm, the Morris worm, in 1988. Another very, very famous story. Another story that caused a lot of this, you know, shoulder pads, news anchors talking to people completely out of their depth. I won't get too deep into the Morris worm because I'm already like 10 minutes late. So, but the Morris worms was another infection that it was the first worm. It was on the ARPANET, which was a precursor to the internet. It managed to infect 6,000 machines, which was 10% of all the machines connected to the ARPANET back then. It infected. It was a combination of exploiting vulnerabilities, also guessing weak passwords. You know, and of course, after that, everybody learned their lessons, and we never had any weak passwords ever again. Option A, did we panic and then learn our lessons? Or B, did we panic and then did nothing? Option B. But we'll talk about worms and Trojans later on, because now we are entering the golden age, the 90s. The 90s are a period that's interesting for several reasons. First, on this sort of pop culture landscape, things have changed. People understand sort of what a hacker is. John Hammond, I think, made this point in his keynote, right? He was like, oh, I wanted to be a hacker. People start to understand. It's still in movies, and you know, it's a lot of clickety-clack, I'm in the mainframe kind of nonsense. You know, swordfish, all these sorts of movies. But people start to get an idea of what it is. The second thing on the technology front is we have a few innovations. One is the commercial internet. This is 1995, I think, around that time. Commercial internet, people are able to network from their homes. They're able to get into the internet. The second thing is Windows 95. When Windows 95 came out, Microsoft said viruses will not be effective anymore, and that is what happened, and that's the end of my talk. No, I think they thought maybe DOS viruses wouldn't work, which was partially true, but Microsoft being Microsoft, they opened the Pandora's box for a lot of other things that were able to become viruses. And as we all know, Windows is like a block of Swiss cheese that's laid on top of a house of cards. And it is. We have Office 95, and Office 95 also brought with it this wonderful thing called macros. And macros, I think somebody thought, wow, this would be super useful. People can automate things, and you can write commands that operate at the same time you operate your file, and you can automate and write, whatever. And there's still a lot of stuff like that. Like, I won't give any examples. I'm already late. So, but Office 95 and macros hit the scene. And macros, does that ring a bell? Because macros, to this day, are used in cybersecurity attacks, in phishing emails. This is when next time you research or you look at some user in your network that was infected by a Word document with a macro on it, just know that you're looking at a prehistoric, a shark, like some kind of alligator that has evolved but hasn't changed much from the early days. And the first virus, this macro virus, the first proof of concept for a macro virus that came out about a month after Office 95 came out. It was called Concept. It was literally a proof of concept. And all that it did was it popped up this alert with this one, and it spread rather quickly. Interestingly enough, it spread rather quickly. In the first month that it came out, it was the fourth most common. This is in 1995. Fourth most common malware. Again, this is Virus Bulletin, by the way. Virus Bulletin today is like this big conference. Back then, it was an actual bulletin with viruses. So you could see, and I think it's self-reporting, you could see how many incidents are happening. So Concept was first sort of number 4. The month after that, it was the second most common virus. The month after that, it was the first most common virus. And then again, the first most common virus. And then 3 years later, every virus is a macro virus. So macros became sort of the dominant form of virus. It just gave you a lot more power. And as we said earlier, DOS viruses kind of went out of style. Windows kind of helped in some ways to, people weren't using DOS anymore. So you have this rise of macros, and of course this was a proof of concept, and as we know from earlier examples, we immediately learned our lesson, and macro viruses never ever bothered us again. No. Of course, now here's the interesting thing. We see this sort of similar trend. When we talked about MS-DOS viruses, we saw, I kind of made this distinction between sort of the first were experimental, then they got a little bit whimsical, fun, they were doing these fun things. Then at some point they got really malicious. Here we see this very similar pattern. We start experimental. This is another macro virus that I think was really, really interesting and fun. It's called the Outlaw virus by Nightmare Joker. What a lovely name. This virus was interesting for a few reasons. The first one is it would obfuscate itself. So it would obfuscate, it was a macro virus. You would open a document, it would basically run the macro. It would also copy the macros to the global macros, which means that every time you start a new document, it would, the global macros will then apply to the document that you open. If I'm understanding this correctly, this is ancient history for me as well. And it would obfuscate the names. It would randomize the names of the macros, because back then the best way that people figured how they could stop macro viruses was by catching the name of the macro. By doing obfuscation, by doing random macro names, it would evade that. The other thing that it did that I thought was really interesting is it would actually drop a file. It would generate a file. It would create a sound file. And let me just explain to you what happens to you if you have this virus on your computer. This virus on January 20th, if you are unlucky enough to use your computer on January 20th and you are unlucky enough to press the key, the E key, which is a very common letter, it would run. It would take over the screen. It would say you are infected with the outlaw virus, and then the file that it drops, the sound file, is a sound of a laugh track. And your computer would start laughing at you, which is so creepy. It's so bizarre. But that's how it would work. So we have these whimsical things, but we're not going to be whimsical for much longer, friends. We're going destructive. And remember the worms that we talked about? Remember the Morris worm? What a wonderful time. 60,000 machines on the ARPANET. 6,000 of them were infected. In 1999, when Melissa viruses sort of comes on the scene, you have 250 million devices on the internet, all sort of tangentially connected, potentially connected. And in this environment, you start to see macroviruses that also worm. And you see sort of the worm is coming back to this conversation. The most famous one, or one of the more famous ones, is the Melissa virus. The Melissa virus was a macrovirus, same story. You ran a document, and then it would, one of the commands that it would run, it would look through your list of contacts, and it would send itself to 50 other contacts. And this, just 50 contacts. And the user still had to open the document. This was so effective in spreading that I don't know how long after it started spreading, but eventually we got to a point where 300 companies in the United States had to shut down. IBM, Microsoft, all had to shut down their email servers, everything just so they can fix this. This was another one of these huge infections that were talked about in the news and minimal amount of lessons learned. Well, that was a Melissa virus. Imagine being Microsoft back then. You have to shut down your company because of the macros that you created, the beast that you unleashed on the world. Well, I shouldn't be so negative, right? I mean, there's good intentions, and there's always people with bad intentions looking to abuse. A year later, we have the I love you virus. It was a very similar virus, only this one would do a lot of different things. It would delete your files. It would cause damage. And that was also causing huge problems. They eventually did catch the guy who wrote the Melissa virus. Again, this was a huge story. But this was a huge development. The ability of viruses to worm, to spread themselves was a huge capability. And we're going to see how this is leveraged as we move ourselves to the 2000s. And in the 2000s, the thing that I feel like is the big development is that as we are now more connected than ever, I think in the 2000s, we really started to really use the potential of the internet to connect. And you start to see file sharing, and you start to see IRC, which is a chatting program, which is also very important for viruses and malware. You start to see messengers like AIM. IRC is particularly important because it eventually becomes a sort of a hub for controlling a malware, and we'll talk about that in a second. So we talked a little bit about Trojans. Now Trojans are making their great comeback. In around this time, around the 2000s, the thing that becomes apparent, well, first we start to see macro viruses decline. We start to see Trojans rise. The ability to share files with people all over the world is, as we know, is a risky business. You're downloading, your favorite Britney Spears album, as people did in the 2000s. And does anybody know who Britney Spears is? Okay, we'll talk about that later. Come after the show. We'll talk about Britney Spears. It's like Sabrina Carpenter of the time. I don't know who Sabrina Carpenter is. So we're on the same terms. So You would download something that you thought was one thing. It ended up being another thing. Maybe you were cracking a computer game that you own, and it, you know, maybe it would also crack the computer game, but at the same time, it would install something else. You know, these things would you would either compile a macro virus, so it didn't run as a macro anymore, but it would run as an executable, or you would do something like this. These are the first RATs, remote access Trojans, or remote administration tools. That abbreviation refers to both. We now use RAT as a remote access Trojan primarily in the security business, and you start to see these things come up. This is partly because we're just so connected, also because, you know, administrators in companies now had a lot of computers connected. You needed a central way to manage them. You needed something that could be deployed, that you could manage computers that you're not directly, you don't directly have access to. But people always find a way to take this concept and make it into something else. Here we also have, interestingly, experimentation, whimsical. This first one over here is NetBus. It was written by a Swedish person. Bus in Swedish is mischief, I believe. So net mischief. And it really was this mischievous program. There was a victim and there was an attacker. The victim was a server and the attacker was a client. And the attacker had some control over the victim machine. So if you got someone to install this on their machine, you could open their CD-ROM when they least expect it, or play a fart sound. High five. This was a lot of fun, but in the same year you have Back Orifice, developed by the Cult of the Dead Cow, which is a famous group of hackers. And Back Orifice was a lot more, it was a lot less fun. A lot less funny, let's say. You could delete files, you could move files, you could do a lot of things. Eventually we have Sub 7. Does anybody here know Sub 7? Script Kiddie Mecha. Sub 7 had a lot of other developments, and primarily one important thing that Sub 7 did is it could communicate back to an IRC server for control. That was a big, big development, because now you don't need to have like this direct, you know, your client and server. You could have that coming into, you could control more than one machine from an IRC server. IRC, again, is a sort of a chatting program, or at least I knew it as a chatting program when I was a teenager. Allows you to, but it gave you the ability to control a lot of machines. And again, this was a Trojan that could do a lot of things: deleting files, moving files, doing all sorts of things, opening your camera. So this was a lot of fun for people. I said script kiddies first earlier, and I don't want to deride. Imagine being 15 and having this much power, right? This was, for some people, was a grand adventure, and I know a lot of people who ended up in security because of this. And it doesn't justify anything. It's just, I think it's just interesting. But remember these Trojans, because what happens when you combine these two elements, these macro viruses that can spread themselves, and then the Trojans, which help give you some control over a machine, which would then communicate back to an IRC server, you start to see the sort of first glances of what botnets would become. And we'll talk a little bit about botnets, but this is what would normally happen in the 2000s. If you sort of look at some of these infections, you have viruses that are either spreading themselves, email, IRC, AM messengers, whatever they can find, and however they can spread themselves, sending themselves to other people, or they're on file sharing or whatever. And these macro viruses or macro viruses they were compiled. They would run, and then they would actually be able to download modules from the internet. So downloaders go all the way back to the 2000s. They would then put some sort of backdoor on the machine, some sort of remote access Trojan, and that would communicate back to a server. Back then, these things were hard-coded. These addresses that you would communicate back to were hard-coded. So back then, if you blocked the IP address, the IOC, whatever it is, you killed the malware. But they were spreading so fast, so quickly, that what you'd see here, you would see these things kind of pop up, these macro viruses pop up. They would spread in the millions. They would go up to 11 million, and then a month later, they're gone because it's blocked and it's done. But these were the precursors for what we know as botnets. They would eventually create botnets, and what ended up dominating or being a large part of the malware scenes in the mid 2000s, 2005 and onwards were botnets. Botnets were sort of putting it all together. You're spreading, and then you can control a bunch of machines, and when you have like a gaggle of computers under your control, you can do a lot of things with them. And this actually gives malware a purpose, because now you can sell things. You could use these computers to do denial of service attacks, and you can sell this as a service. You could do spam. A lot of these did spam. Back in the day, spam was a business, and you'd get paid for it. So it gave it a purpose. This is the beginning of sort of this cyber criminal element. And so you have these botnets popping up. And it was interesting because, again, like I said, when you block the IOC, you kill the malware. So how do you get around that as a malware writer? You iterate. You keep creating new versions of your malware with new addresses, so that when one goes down, you can immediately bring in another one and another one and another one. They were iterating so quickly that the virus writers were having conversations with the people who were taking them down in real time. So this is one of them. This is Nearbot. This is a malware called Nearbot. And the writer of this malware is having, the gist of this conversation is basically he wants them to call it IronBot, but they're calling it Nearbot. But he wants them to call it IronBot. And then he just like curses them and he just tells them how bad they are. But this is really fun, really interesting. By the way, all these things, I have links here below. All of these things, you can read about them from magazines from that time. Like, you can actually read about people researching these things back then. All right, we're moving now from ancient history to very recent history, so we're kind of speeding things up. 2010s, we see new technologies. I would say primarily is that we start to see ransomware that uses cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency, Bitcoin was created it was created in 2008, I think, 2008 or 9. But the first ransomware that used cryptocurrency was CryptoLocker in 2012, 2013. So this is a huge, huge, huge change. Before that, if you wanted to get paid, you either had to run it, on the black internet, or whatever it was, the dark internet, dark web, or you had to use gift cards, for example, or you had to use e-currency. There were all these things that would enable you to accept money for, let's say, blackmail or something like that. But these weren't great ways to get paid because they were traceable, and a lot of people would get caught, and it wasn't very healthy for you to go to prison. So when cryptocurrency came onto the scene, this is a major, major change. Enabled a lot of things. Also, computers are more connected than ever, and these vulnerabilities, you would get vulnerabilities that would affect millions of people. For example, Eternal Blue was a leaked vulnerability that later caused the WannaCry incident in 2017. We see a lot of these types of vulnerabilities. We see a vulnerability pop up every year or so. And so I would say in the decade of 2010 to 2020, what we see mostly rising is ransomware. We see this evolution starting out with these botnets. These botnets would, you have all these computers that you control. Spam is not worth that much anymore, so what do? First, banking Trojans. Banking Trojans would steal banking information. Then later on, ransomware was the thing. The first one to do that, I believe, was the Zeus botnet and CryptoLocker, and it would sort of lock your computer up and demand money. Eventually, this made its way to enterprises and so on, and we kind of know, most of us, I would say, know the story of ransomware and what it did. I wanted to break this down. I have 5 minutes. So this is really simplified. So write your angry emails to BSidesNYC Huxley at BSidesNYC.com. But I wanted to show sort of this. Now, I really couldn't get to every single thing in the history. I focused primarily on some of the older history. When you look at like the 80s, 90s, it's a lot simpler. Once you get past the mid 90s, there's really a lot more to talk about. There's a lot more forms of malware, and when we start to get into all the different kinds of malware, we would be here for another hour, which I would be happy to do, but nobody wants to invite me to do a 2-hour talk. So let's look at this simplified version. You know, we start in the early 80s with these boot sector viruses. These are very simple sort of viruses, or very, very creative, very interesting viruses, but simple compared to what we see today. At the same time, in the 80s, you see worms, you see Trojans. These sort of come up, but not that often. Viruses dominate the malware scene. Then you see macro viruses as an evolution, and eventually these macro viruses gain worming capabilities, and they start to spread themselves. So that we see worms kind of come into the picture. Then we see Trojans start to come into the picture through remote access Trojans. They're back in the picture, and eventually this leads to the creation of botnets, which eventually spread ransomware, and that was the shortest, most concise way I could summarize this. Now, again, your angry emails, send them to Huxley for inviting me to talk. But like, you know, let's think, what can we learn from this history? There's some patterns that I talked about already. What can we learn? What is the dominant technology of this? If I had to write this in 2040, or one of you writes this talk in 2040, what would you look at? The 2020s, what were they like? And AI seems to be a big deal. I don't know if you saw, like, every vendor is an AI vendor. And actually, every vendor was an AI vendor also before AI. So, go figure. But now I think it's for real. So you have all sorts of things now that could that could autonomously do these sorts of things. Like I just saw Burp. Burp is like I don't know how to define Burp, but it also has an AI function. So you could, pen test web applications and websites with AI. I don't know how well it works, but this is kind of, this is going somewhere. So this could be the future. And, it's kind of a nice way to sort of round it all up, because when we started, we talked about this wonder, could there be these programs fighting each other in the web, in the space, the cyberspace. And maybe one day we will see these autonomous, intelligent programs sort of battling it out. Who knows? I would be interested to see. Let's come back. Let's meet again in 2040 and see what happened. My name is Eliad Kimhy. I'm a security researcher at Acronis, producer of a podcast, ex-producer of a podcast. It's an ex-podcast also, Malicious Life, about the history of cybersecurity. And if you like security research, check the True Acronis threat research. Just acronis.com/true. We write about everything, all sorts of threats, nation-state threats. Yeah, that's my pitch. That's it. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Oh, sure. If it's not too difficult, yeah. Yeah, what do you got?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I thought it was kind of interesting, like you were talking about in the 80s, there was a big history of malware and stuff, but a lot of the worst, most insecure technologies were all developed in the 90s. Like you mentioned the macros was a big thing, but like almost anything that came out in the 90s can have some kind of active content in it, like Flash Player, or SVG files can run JavaScript for some reason, or like things like that. Like it seems like there's no concept of security even after such a long time as having malware already.
Yeah, I think first of all that's true. So do I need to like repeat it? I'll repeat it. You're saying, is there a question, by the way?
Yeah, I'm just wondering why there wasn't a security mindset when it seems like there wasn't a security mindset when designing a lot of these technologies in the 90s.
Okay.
Despite the long history of malware that lasted.
Yeah, so the point was made that a lot of the sort of most insecure system came out of the 90s, like Flash, Windows, Office, et cetera, et cetera. And why? Because it all started in the 80s. Why weren't people more security conscious in the 90s? You're asking me for an opinion. I'll give you an opinion. I don't know the answer to that. This wasn't something I was able to cover. But look, the reality is, I'll tell you a secret. Even today, people are writing software that's insecure. So that's one thing. The other thing is there wasn't such an awareness of security in the 90s, and that's exactly the point. Lessons weren't learned, and I think systems were closed. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. So, the point made, the systems were closed, you had to be connected. Yeah. Yeah? I don't, I think to that point, I don't think we anticipated, this is my opinion, I don't think we anticipated just exactly how this technology would evolve. And there's a lot of things, there's just good intentions, right? Like I was researching file fix. Click fix is a phishing technique. File fix is like a more advanced technique. And it turns out that the way it operates, if you put a command in the address bar of Explorer, just the address where it says C whatever user, you can run commands from there. And that's what a great, somebody thought, what a cool feature to put in, Windows. I can write CMD and I can open a command prompt exactly at the directory that I'm in. Great. And then you devise an attack that abuses that to write PowerShell commands. And so I think there was a lot of good intentions, and there was just a lack of foresight. And even today, we run into problems. Even 10 years ago, when WannaCry came out in 2017, we were having a hard time explaining to people that they need to patch. And so it is what it is. Sorry, I probably can't answer the question better than that. And people are starting to stream. Thank you so much. Yeah.